Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now, another big AAA release means another chance for the once popular GTX 750 Ti to try and prove itself yet again. Today we're testing Watch Dogs Legion. Can 2014's mid-range Marvel hold its own here? Well, let's find out. I'm using the Palit 750 Ti, one of my favourites, but let's get into the game and start with the Dx11 and Dx12 performance. Firstly, I ran the game at 1080p with the low preset to see how things went. This gameplay was just to gauge a quick idea of the 750 Ti's performance right off the bat. Firstly, the Dx12 gameplay consistently hit between 20 and 30 FPS, though we rarely hit the upper end of those figures. I wanted to establish whether or not Dx11 or Dx12 would perform better before continuing. This is of course subject to change, as this video will be or has been uploaded on the game's launch day, so bear that in mind. Dx11 mode with the 750 Ti performed about 8% better for me with this setup. This sounds like a big gap, but in reality the average difference between the two frame rate averages was just 2. 23 FPS with Dx12 compared to 25 FPS with Dx11. I therefore decided to continue with Dx11 because I had a feeling we'd need every frame that we could get here. It was obvious from these initial tests that 1080p low was still going to be a little too high for a smooth experience, but luckily the settings can still go lower. The low preset actually retains TAA, high texture filtering and low texture resolution, but these can all be reduced further. Turning everything down to the absolute lowest, including turning off AA completely, meant that we saw far closer to 30 FPS a lot of the time, but there were still some noticeable drops. I don't know how well the jagged edges are coming across on this video either, but there are a lot of them. This isn't a terrible way to play if you don't mind the more than occasional dip, but bear in mind that busier areas will have a further negative impact on the experience. This was actually a better experience than I thought it would be though, to be fair, and 1080p lowest is doing okay. I decided to try and get the game looking as good as possible while trying to retain a 30 FPS average next. How high can we actually turn things up without sacrificing the experience? If you are someone who demands 60 FPS, then unfortunately we've passed that point, but if you're happy with a more console-like experience, minus the probably fancier graphics, then medium isn't entirely out of reach. If we keep the resolution at 1080p but scale the game's internal rendering quality down to 80%, effectively running at 1717 by 965, then the average will come back as 31 FPS, with 1.1% lows that reflect a consistent experience. Capping the frame rate to 30 actually made the drops worse, so turning VSync off and leaving the FPS cap off is your best bet. For an even higher average figure, you can choose the low preset with full fat 1600 by 900p resolution. This will give us 37 FPS overall, but the 1.1% lows are actually a little worse here than they were with 1080p reduced to 80%, despite there not being that much difference between the two resolutions. Still, the game looks okay, to be honest, and if you do have a 750 Ti, bear in mind that it should be playable to some extent if you are willing to make sacrifices. Your CPU and RAM will also impact the overall performance. I'm using what I feel is actually a pretty good value for money i5-10400F, a 6-core 12-threaded alternative to a Ryzen 5 3600 that has no integrated graphics. I'm also using 16 gigs of 2666 MHz DDR4, and what you're seeing here is pretty much what you can expect from a best case scenario 750 Ti setup, as in reality this processor has a lot more to give, and it is being held back by the graphics card, which is ideal in a GPU test. Now, to be honest, I prefer to keep the resolution at Full HD and adjust the in-game resolution scale instead of dropping things down to native 900 and 720p. The performance will pretty much be identical, but you can go even lower than you would otherwise be able to do so natively, and choose resolutions that are slightly below 720 or 900p, even 1080p, without sacrificing too much in terms of the visuals. Keep this in mind here as we ran the game with the low preset at 1214 by 683. This is of course slightly lower than native 720p, but it doesn't really look any lower on my 24-inch display. I was hoping to get close to 60 FPS here, but instead we saw about 10 frames less than that, with an average of 50, and the game still looks fairly nice. We weren't having to remove anti-aliasing or drop the texture settings down even more here either, something which is noticeable visually but doesn't actually do too much to improve performance, oddly enough, at least not with this graphics card. Speaking of which, even turning down the game's resolution scaling to 25% of 1080p didn't really do much to improve the frame rates. It just made things look very blurry and gave us more jagged lines. You're better off just sticking to 1080p with 40% res and using the low preset if you want to ensure that you're getting the best performance from this game with the 750 Ti and not sacrificing too much graphically. Alternatively, if you don't mind 30 FPS with a few noticeable drops, then full fat 1080p with the lowest settings and everything else turned off might also be up for consideration. Now for the final test, and for no other reason just to see what would happen, I switched everything to Ultra at 1080p using the in-game preset. I started off down the local pub and already the frame rate was pretty shocking. This was to be expected, in all honesty. I was just curious here is all. What I will say though is that the game looks very good. I expected unimpressive visuals compared to other 2020 titles, and even watching a lot of trailers I wasn't too impressed, but in person without the YouTube compression, everything looks pretty nice. I can't wait to see how the next generation console versions differ, but that's a topic for another video. For now then, the 750 Ti to some extent has conquered at least another AAA title in late 2020. Okay, maybe that's a bit of a strong word, but it will handle Watch Dogs Legion with at least 30 FPS with some tweaking, and around 50 FPS if you don't mind even more quality sacrifices. 60 FPS is unfortunately not really doable, but this has been the case for some games now with the 750 Ti since about late 2018, especially those bigger AAA titles, and honestly anything above 30 in 2020 with this once mid-range graphics card is a decent achievement. So thank you very much for watching. I apologise if the room or the audio sounds a bit more echoey. I'm redesigning the room, it's just been plastered, so there's no furniture in here apart from this microphone, but anyway, you can probably hear all the traffic as well. Yeah. Thank you for watching. Let me know if you have Watch Dogs Legion, how well it runs on your hardware, particularly lower end stuff as well. You know, any of you out there with 750 Ti's as well, perhaps different processors, maybe, you know, 650 Ti's, older cards, AMD equivalents, perhaps the RX 550, things like that. I'd love to hear how it performs on your setup. Even with my 1080 Ti and i5, I noticed a few stutters at 1080p with the very high settings as well. So as time goes on, I'm sure we'll see various fixes, and on day one, this is how Watch Dogs Legion performs on the 750 Ti. And yeah, it's really not too bad considering the age of the card and how good the game can look. So there we go. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like on it down below, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.